Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I'm a night shift worker at a cryogenic lab. The dark web says we're freezing people alive. I just heard a voice begging from one of the chambers. Alright, so I never thought I'd be the one sharing some creepy story online, especially not here. Usually, I'm the guy who reads these posts, laughs it off, and scrolls past. But last night was different, and I really need to get this out, even if it sounds insane. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of what's happening. Let me start by saying that working the night shift at a cryogenic lab isn't nearly as cool as people think. Whenever I tell someone where I work, they get all wide-eyed, like I'm some mad scientist freezing people to bring them back to life 100 years from now. In reality, it's mostly boring and repetitive. I monitor temperatures, check vitals on the storage tanks, and make sure nothing's leaking. For the most part, it's just me, a dimly lit room, and the hum of the freezers. We're a preservation facility. People pay big money for this, to have their bodies stored after they die, in the hopes that one day science will advance enough to bring them back. I try not to think too much about it. I mean, it's morbid if you dwell on it. So, I don't. I just do my job, clock out, and try to live a normal life outside of the lab. Or, well, I used to. It started a few months back. I was scrolling through Reddit on a slow night when a comment caught my eye. Someone was talking about a list of deep web horrors, and my workplace was mentioned. Just the name of the facility, and a claim that we weren't actually freezing dead bodies. According to this guy, we were freezing people alive. It was ridiculous, of course. There's no way. I even laughed. I mean, I've been working here for almost a year. There's strict documentation and protocols in place. I chalked it up to internet conspiracy nonsense and kept scrolling, but the thought nagged at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Why would someone randomly call out our lab of all places? It's not like we're a popular topic. Barely anyone knows we exist. A couple weeks later, another post popped up. This time, it was a grainy, low-res image of what looked like a row of cryo chambers. It was captioned, "Alive Inside." Now the thing is, I could tell it was taken here. There was a small detail, a scratch on one of the chambers, that was too specific to ignore. I'd seen that scratch myself every night. I even remember wondering how it got there. Now, it was like this shadow hanging over me. My shift started to feel different. I'd get this weird feeling, like someone was watching me, even though I was always alone. I'd catch myself staring at the chambers longer than usual, wondering if maybe those rumors weren't so crazy after all. The nights went on, and I kept trying to shrug it off. But the deep web rumors didn't stop. More posts, some with images, others with messages that were way too detailed to ignore. One post described the sound of soft breathing in the cold. Another said, "Listen carefully. They talk in their sleep." I was still doing my best to brush it all off. But last night, I heard something. It was around 3 a.m. I was doing my usual rounds, checking each chamber, marking off the checklist like always. But when I got to chamber 7, I froze. There was a faint sound coming from inside. My first thought was that it was some kind of technical glitch. These machines can be finicky, and they hum and buzz all the time. But this was different. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded like a voice. I stood there, staring at the chamber, feeling my stomach twist in knots. I put my ear closer, holding my breath to make sure I wasn't just hearing things. That's when I heard it. This quiet, raspy voice, barely more than a whisper. Help! My heart felt like it stopped. I jerked back so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My head was spinning, and my first instinct was to just run, leave, pretend I never heard it. But I didn't. I stayed. I don't know why, but something in me needed to know. I took a deep breath, leaned back in, and whispered, "Hello?" For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. I started to think I'd imagined the whole thing, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Please, don't let me die here." My blood ran cold. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. This couldn't be real. There's no way. The chambers are supposed to be filled with dead bodies. There's no possible way anyone inside could be conscious, let alone speaking. But the voice kept going, a little louder now, like it knew I was listening. "Please, it's so cold. I don't want to be here." I backed away, my mind racing. Every logical thought in my brain was screaming at me that this was impossible. Maybe it was a recording, some kind of twisted prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. That voice, it sounded real. It sounded desperate. And now, I can't shake it. All I can think about is the dark web posts, the whispers of people being frozen alive. The thing is, we don't actually do the freezing process here. That's handled at some other facility before they're shipped to us. So, what if something's happening before they get here? I couldn't sleep after my shift ended. I'm writing this now, and I don't know what to do. I'm terrified of going back tonight, but at the same time, I need to know if I'll hear that voice again. I don't know what's happening here, but something about that chamber isn't right. I spent the entire day with that voice replaying in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. That weak, pleading whisper, the kind of sound that doesn't leave you alone. By the time my next shift rolled around, I was half hoping I'd dreamt the whole thing. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The walk to work felt longer than usual, each step heavier, my heart racing as I got closer to the building. Usually, my job feels like a quiet, boring routine. But tonight, that silence felt like it was swallowing me up. The whole place looked different. Shadows seemed darker, lights felt dimmer, and every noise felt amplified. I could practically hear my own heartbeat as I swiped my keycard and the doors clicked open. The lab is usually empty at night. It's just me and a massive, windowless room filled with rows of cryo chambers softly humming under the fluorescent lights. But tonight, it felt like I wasn't alone. There was this strange, oppressive weight in the air, like something was watching me, something lurking just out of sight. I could feel it, but I couldn't place it. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward. I started my routine, trying to go through each check without thinking too much about Chamber 7. I kept telling myself that I'd misheard something, that maybe it was a vent or a random pipe in the wall, but it didn't help. Every step I took, every chamber I checked, I felt that pull toward Chamber 7. I couldn't ignore it. Finally, it was right in front of me. The metal door looked the same as always. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. But I knew better. I knew what I'd heard. I leaned in closer, listening, almost afraid to breathe. Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd been wrong after all. I sighed, relief flooding over me. But then, just as I started to pull away, I heard it. That whisper, faint and shaky, like it was barely clinging to life. "Don't leave me, please." My stomach twisted. Every instinct told me to turn around, to walk out of that room and never come back. But something inside me, some mix of curiosity and dread, kept me rooted to the spot. I leaned in closer, pressing my ear to the metal surface, barely able to keep my hands from trembling. "Hello," I whispered, half expecting nothing in return. Silence, but then, after a few seconds, a response. "Where am I?" It was so soft, so fragile, that I almost didn't catch it. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to answer. You're in a cryogenic lab." There was a pause, and then a gasp, like the realization was sinking in on the other side. No, I was supposed to wake up. I don't want to be here anymore. Please. It's so cold." The voice broke, and I felt this wave of dread wash over me. The way they spoke, it sounded like they didn't know how they'd ended up here, like they hadn't chosen this. I could feel panic clawing at my insides. Everything I'd read on the dark web flooded back. The whispers about people being preserved against their will. The rumors of them being injected with some sedative that kept them barely conscious while their bodies were frozen. The kind of horror that sounded too twisted to be true. But now, with this voice in my ear, it didn't feel like a rumor anymore. Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The reply came slowly, almost like they were struggling to remember. "My name is... I don't remember." I felt a cold sweat break over me. Whoever they were, it sounded like they'd been in there for a long time, long enough to start forgetting pieces of themselves. My mind raced with questions, but I didn't know what to ask. What would even make sense? All I knew was that whatever this was, it shouldn't be possible. They were supposed to be dead, frozen with no consciousness, just empty bodies in a deep sleep. And yet, here I was, talking to someone who was very much aware of their own suffering. I reached into my pocket, my hand brushing against my phone. For a second, I considered recording the voice, but something stopped me. It felt wrong, like some kind of betrayal. And besides, I wasn't sure anyone would even believe me. Instead, I forced myself to focus on the voice. "Do you know how long you've been in there?" I asked. There was a shaky exhale, almost like a sob. I don't know. It's like time doesn't make sense. It's just cold. So cold. All the time. Please, if you can, help me. Let me out." The desperation in their voice was gut-wrenching. I could almost feel their pain, the endless cold pressing in on them from all sides. And the more they spoke, the harder it was to keep my own fear in check. But here's the thing. I don't have access to the chamber locks. Only upper management does, and the controls are kept in a secure room that I don't have clearance for. I'd always thought it was just a security measure. No need for night shift employees to have full access. But now, I was starting to think it was something else. Like maybe they were hiding something, keeping us from seeing what was really going on in these chambers. I don't know if I can," I stammered, feeling helpless. "I don't have the keys. I don't even know how to open these." There was silence on the other side, and for a moment, I thought maybe they drifted off again, fading back into whatever tortured sleep they were in. But then, they whispered, They know. They know I'm awake. What do you mean? I asked, my voice shaking. They watch us. They watch to make sure we don't wake up. Sometimes I can hear them, voices, like yours, on the other side of the glass. I felt a chill run down my spine. If they were right, then it meant someone out there knew these people were conscious, that they could feel every second of their frozen nightmare. And if that was true, then that person wasn't just freezing bodies. They were torturing souls. At that moment, I felt this overwhelming urge to leave, to walk out of that building and never look back. But then the voice started up again, more desperate, more frantic. Please, please, if you can't open it, just don't leave me alone here. Talk to me. Let me know someone's there. I couldn't bring myself to answer, my mind spinning in 100 directions. But before I could think of anything to say, a loud click echoed through the room, and the lights flickered for a moment. I turned around, heart racing, expecting to see someone or something standing behind me. But there was no one, just the same empty room, rows of chambers humming away in eerie unison. I glanced back at Chamber 7, heart hammering, but the voice was gone. The silence was deafening, suffocating. It was like they'd been cut off mid-sentence, like someone had flipped a switch and silenced them. I don't remember the rest of my shift. I don't even know how I made it through. All I know is that the next time I checked, it was morning, and my legs were aching from standing in one spot for hours. Now I'm back home, still trying to make sense of everything. I don't know if I'll go back tonight, but if I do, I need to know if that voice will be there again. I need to know if they're still alive, or if someone's already found a way to keep them quiet for good. The entire day felt like a fever dream. I couldn't get that voice out of my head, that desperate, broken whisper begging not to be left alone. I tried to distract myself, tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I'd been overthinking those dark web rumors. But no matter what I told myself, I knew one thing for sure. That voice had been real. As night fell, I knew I had to go back. I kept telling myself I'd quit after tonight, hand in my badge, and never look back. But something inside me couldn't let it go, like I owed it to that person, or whatever was left of them, to find out the truth. When I arrived, the place was quieter than usual. There was a strange tension in the air, like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. I checked in, feeling my pulse race as I swiped my keycard and stepped inside. The hallway leading to the lab was empty and echoing. The faint hum of the machines in the distance did nothing to calm my nerves. Just as I reached the door, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at the screen, expecting some spam text or an update from social media, but it wasn't either of those. It was a message from an unknown number. All it said was, "Don't listen to them." I stopped dead in my tracks, my hand starting to shake. No name, no context, just those 4 words. But I knew exactly what it was talking about. Part of me wanted to turn around, to take that message as a warning, and just leave. But I felt like I'd come too far. I needed to know what was happening, no matter how messed up it was. I stuffed my phone back in my pocket and pushed open the door to the lab. The room looked just like it always did. Rows of cryo chambers, bathed in that cold, clinical light, stretching out in eerie silence. But as I walked down the rows, each step felt heavier, like the air was getting thicker, pressing down on me. When I got to Chamber 7, I stopped, staring at it. It looked the same as always, the small scratch near the handle catching the light. But something felt off, like there was a presence in the room, something watching me, waiting. I leaned closer, half expecting to hear that voice again, but all I got was silence. I reached out, hesitating, and pressed my hand against the cold metal of the chamber, almost as if I could reach through to whatever was inside. And then, like a punch to the gut, I felt it, a soft thud from the other side of the door. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A sound, like someone weakly tapping, as if they were trying to get my attention. My heart raced. Can you hear me? I whispered, my voice barely a breath. There was a pause, and then the tapping came again, slightly louder this time, more frantic. I felt my stomach twist. The idea that someone was conscious in there, aware enough to respond to me, made my skin crawl. I tried to keep my voice steady, to keep my fear from showing. "Who are you?" I asked. The tapping stopped, and then faintly, a voice whispered through the chamber door. "Please, don't let them take me." I swallowed, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to be standing there, listening in. The voice sounded more afraid than before, desperate, like they knew something I didn't. Who's taking you?" I managed, my voice shaking. "The ones who watch. They're coming. Don't leave me alone. They know I'm awake. They know." I felt a chill run down my spine. The words sounded like something out of a nightmare, a fractured memory bubbling up from the depths of a terrified mind. I couldn't tell if they were making sense or if the person on the other side was slowly losing whatever sanity they had left. Then, before I could say anything else, the door to the lab clicked open. I spun around, heart pounding, and saw a figure step inside. It was the facility's supervisor, Dr. Michaels. He was the last person I expected to see here at this hour. Usually, he was only around during the day shift, rarely even acknowledging my existence. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, his voice casual, but his eyes were sharp, like he was assessing every detail of the room, every movement I made. I felt my mouth go dry. Yeah, just doing my rounds," I stammered, hoping he couldn't hear the fear in my voice. He stared at me for a long moment, a faint smile playing at the edges of his mouth, but there was no warmth behind it. It was the kind of smile you see when someone knows something you don't, something you're not supposed to know. "Good to hear," he said finally. "These chambers are delicate. We wouldn't want anything unexpected happening to them." I nodded, feeling my pulse race. There was something off about the way he spoke, like he was choosing his words carefully, keeping me on edge. He lingered for a moment, eyes scanning the room, before he finally turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. As soon as he was gone, I felt that sense of dread settle over me again. I looked back at Chamber 7, my mind racing. The voice inside had sounded terrified, of the ones who watch. And now, with Dr. Michaels showing up out of nowhere, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was one of them, that he knew exactly what was happening inside these chambers, and was keeping a close eye on anyone who got too curious. My phone buzzed again, and I pulled it out, my hands trembling. It was another message from that unknown number. "They're coming for you. Don't trust anyone." I stared at the screen, my mind spinning. I didn't know who was sending these messages or how they knew what was happening, but something about it felt real. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, taking a shaky breath. If this was a warning, I needed to be careful. I needed to find out what was really going on in this place before it was too late. I spent the rest of my shift on edge, feeling like every shadow was watching me. Every flicker of light was a warning. I kept my distance from Chamber 7, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone inside was still aware, still waiting for me to do something. And every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected Dr. Michaels to be there, silently observing, waiting for me to make a wrong move. By the time my shift ended, I felt like I was going insane. I clocked out and practically ran to my car, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about those messages, about the voice in the chamber, about Dr. Michaels and the way he'd looked at me, like he knew exactly what I was afraid of. As I started the engine, my phone buzzed one more time. I glanced at it, hands trembling, and saw a final message from the unknown number. Get out. Don't go back. You don't know what you're dealing with. I stared at the message, feeling a mix of fear and confusion. Part of me wanted to listen, to walk away and never look back. But another part of me, some stubborn need for answers, refused to let it go. I couldn't just forget that voice, that desperate plea for help. I drove home in silence, every shadow outside my window making me flinch, every flash of headlights feeling like it was following me. That message, those whispers, it was like they were burned into my mind. And even as I tried to sleep, I kept hearing that voice, the words echoing in the darkness of my bedroom. Don't let them take me. Don't leave me alone. The next night, I told myself I'd stay away. I rehearsed it in my head all day, convincing myself that I'd call in sick, that I'd finally listen to the warnings and let it go. But as the night crept closer, I felt that pull again, an itch that wouldn't stop, the unanswered questions pressing down on me until I couldn't ignore them anymore. I had to know what was happening in that lab. When I got there, the building was eerily empty, more than usual. I could have sworn I heard faint footsteps echoing somewhere down the hall as I clocked in, but every time I looked, no one was there. The entire place had this heavy, oppressive silence, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. My routine felt mechanical, each step familiar, but my heart was pounding the whole time. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Dr. Michaels watching from the shadows, waiting to catch me doing something I shouldn't. But it was just me and the humming of the chambers. Or so I thought. When I got to Chamber 7, my instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to ignore it and just get through the night. But the air around it felt different, colder. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't stop myself from pressing my ear to the metal, holding my breath. Silence. A full minute passed, nothing but the low hum of the freezer. I pulled away, relieved. But then, just as I started to turn, I heard it again, so faint it was almost a breath. Please, don't go. The voice was weaker, softer, barely hanging on. It sounded different this time, almost resigned, like they knew there was no escape. I felt this horrible guilt pressing down on me, like I'd already let them down just by hesitating. I leaned back in, whispering, I'm here. I'm listening. Tell me what's happening to you. Silence stretched between us, and then, in a voice so broken and fragile, it barely sounded human, they whispered, They keep us here. Watch us. Make sure we don't remember. I could feel my stomach twisting. Who keeps you here? There was a pause, and I thought maybe they'd slipped back into that frozen oblivion. But then the voice continued. struggling with every word. They come. When we wake up, they take pieces of us, and then we forget. I don't know my own name. I can't remember. My throat tightened, horror clawing at me. I'd always thought of the cryo chambers as safekeeping, as a way to preserve people's bodies until the future. But the voice sounded terrified, like they were being held against their will, kept in some twisted kind of living death. The thought made my skin crawl. This wasn't preservation, it was torture. As I tried to process what I was hearing, there was a loud click behind me, followed by the familiar sound of footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding. I knew that sound all too well. Dr. Michaels was here. Still working, I see, he said, his voice low and calm, but with a hint of amusement that made my skin crawl. I turned slowly, forcing myself to keep my expression neutral. Yeah, just finishing up the rounds, I said, hoping he couldn't see how tense I was. Dr. Michaels tilted his head, studying me. Good to hear. The chambers require special care. Some of them more than others. His gaze drifted to Chamber 7, lingering for a moment too long. We wouldn't want anything unexpected to happen. I swallowed, nodding, trying to keep my hands from shaking. He looked at me for another beat, his eyes cold and calculating, before he finally turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. As soon as he was gone, I let out a shaky breath, my heart racing. I knew then that he knew something, maybe everything, and that message I'd received, the one warning me not to trust anyone. It was starting to make a lot more sense. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange. The security door at the back of the lab, the one that only upper management had access to, was slightly ajar. I'd never seen it open before. It was always locked, sealed tight with a keypad and a badge scanner. My curiosity got the better of me, and I crept closer, peering inside. Beyond the door was a dimly lit stairwell leading down, disappearing into darkness. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to walk away. But if I didn't go down there, I knew I'd never get the answers I needed. I took a deep breath and stepped through the door, letting it close softly behind me. The stairwell was cold, the air thick with an unfamiliar metallic smell. Each step creaked under my weight, echoing off the concrete walls. I could feel my heart pounding, every beat loud in the silence. At the bottom of the stairs, there was another door, this one heavier, with a sign that read, Vault Access, Restricted Personnel Only. I pushed it open, stepping into a room bathed in a strange low blue light. It was colder here, much colder than the lab upstairs, and in the center of the room were more chambers. Not the standard cryo units I was used to, but something different, more industrial, with wires and tubes snaking across the floor like veins, leading to a massive console. But what caught my attention wasn't the machines. It was the glass window at the back of the room. Through it, I could see rows of cryo chambers, dozens of them, stretching out into the darkness. They were packed in tight, like a storage facility, but these weren't numbered, weren't labeled. They were hidden. I stepped closer, pressing my hand to the glass. My breath fogged up the surface, and I squinted, trying to see inside the chambers. And that's when I saw it. There was movement, slow, weak, like someone struggling to raise their hand, pressing it against the inside of the chamber, just like I was pressing against the glass. I felt my stomach drop as I realized they were awake. I stumbled back, my mind racing. All those dark web posts, all those rumors, they were true. They were keeping these people alive, aware, trapped in an endless nightmare. I didn't know how or why, but it was clear that Dr. Michaels and whoever else was running this place were involved in something beyond anything I'd ever imagined. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the sudden noise making me jump. I pulled it out, hands shaking, and saw another message from the unknown number. Get out. They know you're there. Before I could even process the message, I heard footsteps echoing down the stairwell behind me, hurried and heavy. Panic surged through me. I looked around, searching for an exit, but there was only one way out. Back up the stairs, past whoever was coming down. I backed up, pressing myself against the wall, heart hammering as the footsteps grew closer. Then I saw Dr. Michael step into the room, flanked by two other men in lab coats. They scanned the room, their eyes landing on the glass window, on the chambers, on me. Dr. Michael's expression was cold, calculated, a twisted satisfaction in his eyes. "Didn't I tell you?" he said, his voice low and mocking. "Some chambers require special care." I didn't wait to hear what he would say next. I turned and bolted, racing up the stairs, my footsteps pounding against the metal as I took the steps two at a time. Behind me, I could hear the men following, their voices cold and unhurried, like they knew I had nowhere to go. I burst back into the lab, slamming the door behind me, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I needed to get out of this building, away from this nightmare. I sprinted down the hallway, past the rows of silent chambers, not daring to look back. Just as I reached the exit, I glanced over my shoulder, and for a split second, I thought I saw something in the reflection of the glass doors. A figure inside Chamber 7, watching me, hand pressed against the glass, a silent plea that I couldn't ignore. The last words I heard before I pushed through the doors and into the cold night air echoed in my mind, chilling me to the core. They won't let you leave, not when you know their secret. But I didn't care. I was out, and I wasn't going back. As I stumbled into the empty parking lot, the weight of what I'd seen, what I'd heard, pressed down on me, suffocating. I got in my car, hands shaking, and sped off, the dark outline of the building shrinking in my rearview mirror, a shadow of secrets and suffering I could never forget. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind reeling, every streetlight, casting shadows that seemed too close, too sinister. The events of the last few nights felt unreal, like a fevered nightmare, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I could still feel the icy press of the chamber door under my hand, still hear the terrified whispers echoing in my mind. The voice inside Chamber 7, the hidden vault beneath the lab, the sight of those people trapped in a living frozen hell. It was all too real. Eventually, I parked at an all-night diner off the highway, the only place that felt anonymous and far enough away from the lab. I sat in my car, staring blankly into the darkness, not sure what to do next. My hands were still trembling, my mind flipping through the images of those hidden chambers, Dr. Michaels' cold smile, the feeling that something more sinister was lurking behind every silence, every empty hallway. I checked my phone, hoping for some kind of update from that unknown number, but there was nothing. Just that last, chilling message warning me to leave. I felt like whoever had been helping me had already accepted that I was doomed, that knowing the truth meant there was no way out. As the sun started to rise, I finally made a decision. I wasn't going to stay silent. I couldn't. I pulled out my laptop, opening my email, ready to send everything I knew to every news outlet I could think of. I couldn't stop thinking of the people in those chambers, their faint movements, the desperate whispers, the awareness in their eyes. They had been left to rot in darkness, forgotten, and if I did nothing, it would all stay hidden. I typed everything, from the rumors on the dark web to the events of the past nights, the voice I'd heard, the hidden vault, and Dr. Michaels's suspicious behavior. I attached every photo I'd taken of the lab, even though it was limited, and hovered over the send button, my finger trembling. Just as I was about to hit send, my phone buzzed. I jumped, glancing down to see another message from the unknown number. "Don't! It's not safe. You're being watched." I froze, my finger hovering over the screen. My heart was racing, and every instinct screamed at me to hit send anyway. But something about the message made me hesitate. Who was this person? How did they know where I was, what I was doing? It was like they were tracking every move I made. And then it hit me. The lab's security system. I remembered seeing small cameras in every corner, recording every shift, every check, every moment I'd spent standing in front of Chamber 7. My stomach sank as I realized that everything I'd done was probably already logged somewhere. They knew exactly what I'd seen. They'd watched me. They'd heard me talking to the voice in Chamber 7. Dr. Michaels hadn't just stumbled upon me by accident. He'd been waiting. A cold dread settled over me. If I sent that email, they'd find me. Maybe they already were on their way. I closed my laptop, my hands shaking as I tried to process what this meant. It wasn't just the chambers or the voices trapped inside them. It was the people running the place, the ones willing to do anything to keep their secrets buried. I had no idea who I could trust. My mind raced through every person I'd spoken to at the lab, every colleague, but it was no use. It was like everyone there was a shadow, just another pair of eyes keeping watch. The message had warned me. Whoever was sending these, they knew more than I did, and if I didn't listen, I might not have any chance to escape. For the next few days, I laid low, going through the motions of life, but always looking over my shoulder, every stranger feeling like a threat, every glance a sign that they knew. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the handprint pressed against the glass of the hidden vault, that desperate plea frozen in time. But the silence didn't last. On the fourth night after I'd left the lab, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "Go to the lab. Now. You're out of time." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. The last place I wanted to go was that lab, but the urgency in the text was unmistakable. My gut twisted with a feeling I couldn't shake, that this was my last chance to find the truth, or at least my last chance to see if anyone else could be saved. I drove to the lab, the building looming in the dark, like a silent monolith, its walls concealing horrors I could barely wrap my head around. The parking lot was empty, and as I approached the entrance, I saw the lights were off, the front desk unstaffed. The entire place was deathly quiet. It felt like walking into a tomb. I slipped inside, moving carefully, every creak of my footsteps amplified in the silence. My flashlight cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to twist and move along the walls. I made my way to the lab, the door already slightly ajar, as if it was waiting for me. When I stepped inside, my breath caught. Chamber 7 was open. The chamber door hung slightly open, the glass fogged over, and inside, I saw nothing. The chamber was empty, no sign of the person I'd spoken to, no trace of the voice that had haunted my every thought. The only evidence was a faint smear on the glass, like a handprint, quickly fading in the cold. I heard footsteps behind me, and I whipped around, my heart hammering. Dr. Michaels was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of cold indifference. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice calm, almost amused. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. He stepped closer, his eyes sharp and calculating, and I knew that he knew everything. There was no hiding what I'd seen, no undoing what I knew. "You weren't supposed to know," he said, shaking his head slowly. "People like you never understand that there are things best left buried." He gestured to the empty chamber, his smile dark and empty. "Some experiments are too valuable to be interrupted." I took a step back, feeling trapped, desperate to escape. "They're still alive in there," I managed, my voice barely more than a whisper. "They know what's happening. You're torturing them." Dr. Michaels chuckled, shaking his head. "Alive? Perhaps. Conscious? Sometimes. But it's necessary. The mind's resilience is remarkable when harnessed properly." I felt sick, my entire body trembling. This wasn't science. This was a nightmare, something twisted and evil. And I knew then that he had no intention of letting me leave. But just as he stepped forward, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number, and somehow I knew it was my last. "Run! Now!" I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted, slipping past Dr. Michaels and racing down the hallway, my footsteps pounding in my ears. Behind me, I could hear his voice shouting, calling for backup, but I didn't stop. I sprinted out of the lab, throwing myself into my car, barely taking the time to start the engine before peeling out of the parking lot. I drove through the night, not stopping, not looking back, until the lab was miles behind me, swallowed by the darkness. That was a week ago. Since then, I've been moving from place to place, never staying too long, always watching over my shoulder. My phone hasn't buzzed again. Whoever was helping me seems to have vanished, as if they were only there to get me out. But I still see that place in my dreams. The cold glass of the chamber, the hidden vault, the faint sound of tapping on the other side. I hear that broken voice, pleading, begging, trapped in that endless frozen hell. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever really escape, or if I'll be running for the rest of my life, haunted by what I saw, hunted by those who never wanted their secrets revealed. Because some nights, just as I'm about to fall asleep, I think I can still hear it, a faint whisper in the silence. "Don't leave me alone." I'm a paranormal investigator. I found a dark web stream showing my house at night, and someone's filming me from inside. Alright, I need to preface this by saying I'm not the type to get spooked easily. I've been a paranormal investigator for almost 8 years, and I've seen some weird things, believe me. Shadow figures, unexplainable cold spots, flickering lights at exactly 3:33 a.m. You name it. I'd get scared, sure. But in this line of work, you build a tolerance. You learn how to keep your cool, how to separate the explainable from the truly bizarre. But this isn't something I know how to handle. This all started about a month ago, when I got a tip from a guy I knew, someone who, let's say, specializes in strange online communities. I won't give too many details for obvious reasons, but he's one of those hackers who pokes around on the dark web for fun. He's reliable, if a little unhinged, and he tends to give me tips about places that might interest me. A haunted forum here, a supposed occult marketplace there. That kind of thing. But this time, he messaged me in the middle of the night with a link. Just a link. And next to it, he typed one line. "Don't watch this alone." Now, I've always considered myself a skeptic. Even after years of ghost hunting, I rarely find something I can't explain. But there was something different about this message. My friend's tone was off. Usually, he's pretty flippant about this stuff, but this time he sounded genuinely rattled. I brushed it off, thinking he was messing with me. It wouldn't be the first time, so I did what any investigator would do. I clicked on the link. When I did, it took me to a video stream, a black and white grainy feed that looked like it was being filmed on an old-school security camera. The image was dark, with faint shadows moving in and out of frame. I squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. It was a house, empty and dimly lit by some weak outdoor lighting. It took me a minute, but then I realized it was my house. At first, I thought it was just a joke. My friend had probably pulled up some street view image or something, then added a filter to make it look like security footage. I mean, who wouldn't think that, right? So I laughed it off, typed out a quick, very funny message, and closed the stream. But it kept bothering me. It felt too real. I mean, I knew the layout of my own home like the back of my hand, and the angles in that footage were just too perfect. So I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was overworked, or maybe my friend had just found an eerily similar house, but the stream link wouldn't leave my mind. The idea just kept gnawing at me, scratching at the back of my brain. I couldn't sleep, so I ended up pouring myself a drink and opening my laptop again. When I clicked on the link a second time, the stream was still live, still showing my house. But this time, it was different. The angle had changed. This time, the camera was pointing at my front door. The light outside my door flickered in and out, like it always does, a detail I didn't think anyone would notice. It's this small quirk of my house that always annoyed me, but seeing it on a live stream was surreal. I sat there frozen, watching as the camera zoomed in slightly, the grainy lens adjusting like someone was physically moving it closer. At that point, I was convinced my friend had set this up somehow, probably hidden a camera outside my house as a prank. I texted him something like, "All right, you got me. Where's the camera?" But he didn't respond. Instead, a new line of text appeared under the stream. I hadn't noticed the chat feature before, but there it was, bold white letters against a pitch black background. "You're watching, aren't you?" I blinked at the screen, feeling this weird, uncomfortable chill run down my spine. I typed back, "Who is this?" Very funny. Nothing. The camera feed didn't budge either. It just stayed locked on my front door, completely still. I kept waiting for something to happen, for the camera to move, or for someone to type back. But after a few minutes, nothing happened. So I assumed it was some automated prank, just some dark web bot programmed to freak people out. I was about to close the tab when the camera shifted again, slowly. Now, it was pointed at my living room window, the one that faces out onto the street. I watched, feeling this unease build as the feed zoomed in, almost like someone was scanning the room from outside. Then the camera paused, dead still, and focused on a shadow near the edge of the window. At first, it looked like just a trick of the light, but then, as my eyes adjusted to the grainy darkness, I realized it was a figure. A tall, thin figure, standing outside my window, barely visible in the dark. They were motionless, just standing there, facing my house. And then the line of text appeared again. "I can see you." I slammed my laptop shut and checked every lock in my house, grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a crowbar actually, and took a deep breath. But when I finally mustered the courage to look outside, no one was there. After that night, things changed. I know I sound like one of those paranoid conspiracy nuts, but hear me out. I was sure someone was watching me. At first, I tried to brush it off as a bad dream. You know, just my mind playing tricks after staring at the screen for too long. I figured I was seeing things, like those after images you get after staring at a light too long, but it didn't feel like that. The next day, I went through the motions, trying to keep everything normal. Made coffee, answered some emails, checked my equipment for an upcoming investigation I'd planned for the weekend. But there was this itch, this uneasy feeling creeping up the back of my neck, like I was being watched. It was subtle at first. Every time I looked out the window or turned a corner, I half expected to see someone standing there, watching. I kept glancing at the door, the windows, even the small gap under my blinds, as if someone would be staring right back. Around noon, I checked my laptop again, feeling a ridiculous pull to open that link. I knew I shouldn't. I was almost afraid of what I'd see if the stream was still live. But curiosity, or maybe it was paranoia, got the better of me. I clicked the link, and there it was again. My house, live streamed in grainy black and white from an angle just outside my front door. Only this time, the angle had changed. Now, the camera was pointing through a small crack in my living room blinds. I was staring at my own couch, my coffee table, the papers I'd scattered that morning. I was looking at the inside of my own house from an angle no one should have had access to. For a second, I just stared, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Someone would have to be inside to get that angle. But the weird part, the part that made my stomach churn, was how precise the setup was. I couldn't see the whole room, just a sliver of it, like they were purposely trying to stay hidden from view. I took a deep breath and typed out, "Who are you?" in the chat window, fully expecting silence. To my surprise, the answer popped up immediately. "A friend." That single word made my blood run cold. A friend? I didn't know anyone who would pull a prank like this, and certainly not someone with the technical skills to hack into my house. For the first time, it dawned on me that this wasn't just some elaborate joke. Someone was watching me, someone who knew I'd be watching back. I scrambled around the house, checking every lock, every possible entry point. Windows were sealed shut, doors locked tight, everything exactly as it should be. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that someone was one step ahead of me. I turned off the stream and called my hacker friend to see if he'd finally own up to it. No answer, not even voicemail, just an endless ringing. Hours passed, and I was starting to think I was genuinely losing it. I wanted to turn my mind off, to take a break from the whole situation. But around 9 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from my hacker friend. I opened it, and my heart nearly stopped. "Get out of the house," I immediately replied, asking what he meant, but he didn't respond. I called him, and for the first time, he picked up. His voice was tense, almost breathless. "You're still there?" he asked, sounding genuinely panicked. "Yeah, what's going on? Is this you messing with me?" I was trying to keep my voice calm, but I could hear the panic creeping in. "It's not me, all right? I thought you were messing with me." His voice dropped to a whisper, as if he was afraid someone would overhear. "I don't know what you got yourself into, man, but it's bad. This goes deeper than just some prank." "What do you mean?" He paused, like he was trying to figure out how much to say. I traced the link. I thought it was a regular dark web stream, just some creepy underground crap. But this was different. It's run through layers of encryption, bouncing through servers in places I don't even want to name. I tried to shut it down, but someone's protecting it. Like, really protecting it. My mind raced as I tried to process what he was saying. "So, what? Someone's watching me for real? Why?" He hesitated. "I don't know, but I can tell you this. The people running that stream, they're not amateurs, they're not pranksters. This is high-level stuff, and if they're watching you, they want something. And that means they're probably in there with you." I was about to ask him what to do when he whispered, "Get out. Right now." I hung up and grabbed my keys, heart pounding in my chest as I made my way to the front door. Every creak, every shadow, felt like it was moving in my peripheral vision, like someone was watching my every step. I fumbled with the lock, hands shaking as I tried to keep myself from full-blown panic. And then I heard it. This faint, soft click coming from my bedroom. The kind of sound you hear when someone's trying to open a door quietly, hoping you won't notice. I froze, my hand still on the lock, ears straining to catch any other sound. Another soft rustling came, this time closer, right down the hallway. I had two options: wait and see who it was, or run. I chose to run. I tore the door open and bolted into the night, not stopping until I was halfway down the street. I turned back to see if anyone was following me, but the street was empty, completely silent. My house sat there, dark and foreboding, almost like it was watching me back. I grabbed my phone and called my friend again, desperate for any sort of guidance. But this time, the line went dead after a single ring. I was on my own. I spent the night in my car, parked on the far side of town, hidden between two abandoned buildings. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. I barely slept, my mind running through every possible scenario. When the sun finally rose, I drove back to my house, praying that whatever was inside had left. I pulled into the driveway, and from the outside, everything looked normal. But as I walked up to the front door, I noticed something strange. My blinds were open, just slightly, and the front door was unlocked. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. A faint, metallic odor, like rusted iron. It lingered in the air, sharp and unmistakable. I slowly walked down the hallway, my heart pounding with every step, and that's when I saw it. On my living room coffee table, placed neatly in the center, was an old camcorder. Not mine. It was ancient, covered in dust, as if it hadn't been touched in years. But the strangest part was the small, handwritten note beside it. It said, simply, "Smile, you're on camera." I reached out, hesitating before picking up the camcorder. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and with a trembling hand, I pressed play. The screen flickered to life, grainy and distorted, like some old home video. The camera angle was familiar, too familiar. It was me, sleeping in my bed, recorded from a dark corner of my room. The camcorder felt heavier than it should have. Maybe it was the weight of the situation pressing down on me, but holding that thing in my hand felt like holding a loaded gun. My hands were shaking so badly that the grainy footage on the screen blurred as I replayed it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was footage of me in bed, taken from the far side of my room. The timestamp showed last night, just a few hours after I'd bolted out of the house. I could see myself tossing and turning, oblivious to the fact that someone was standing in the shadows, watching, filming. The angle was so precise, it was like whoever held the camera knew exactly where to stand to stay out of sight. I skipped ahead, hoping to find some clue about who was behind this. I pressed fast forward, watching the screen jump through time as minutes flew by in eerie silence. Eventually, I stopped the tape, letting it play as the image settled back into normal speed. The footage had shifted to the hallway, right outside my bedroom door. My breath hitched as I watched the camera's grainy lens focus on the door, zooming in on the knob. The person holding it must have been just outside, creeping down the hall, moving inch by inch closer to where I'd been sleeping. The slow zoom was almost cinematic, like some twisted horror movie. But this was real. This was my home, my bedroom, and there was someone else in it. I watched as the camera lingered there, just outside my room, the figure's shadow faintly visible along the edge of the doorframe. The person was waiting, listening, and then, slowly, the camera turned, as if something else had caught their attention. The angle shifted, moving back down the hallway, gliding silently toward the living room, and then I heard something that nearly made my blood freeze, the soft, unmistakable sound of my own voice. "Who are you?" it repeated, almost mockingly, echoing my words from the chat window last night. But it was twisted, distorted somehow, like it was coming from an old tape recorder. The camera turned toward the source of the sound, settling on a small, shadowy corner near my bookshelf. I could see the faint outline of something sitting on the floor, a small speaker connected to a bundle of tangled wires. They'd been broadcasting my own voice back to me, over and over, from some hidden setup inside my house. I stopped the tape, my mind racing. This wasn't just some prank. Whoever was behind this was playing with me, laying out this sick, twisted game. They wanted me to know they'd been here, that they'd been watching, and that they could come back anytime they wanted. I needed to leave, get as far from the house as possible. I grabbed a few essentials, stuffing them into a backpack as I tried to steady my breathing. I'd already called the police, but they brushed me off, chalking it up to a domestic dispute or some kind of prank. Without physical evidence, they wouldn't send anyone out. I started toward the door, but then a thought crossed my mind. A dangerous thought, but one I couldn't shake. If this person had been recording me, if they'd been in my house for who knows how long, then maybe they'd left something else behind. Another camera, another clue, something that could help me prove I wasn't losing it. I hesitated, my eyes scanning the room, the paranoia creeping in as I tried to guess where they'd put a camera if they'd hidden one. And that's when I noticed it, a small glint of something metallic just behind one of my books on the shelf. I walked over slowly, heart pounding, and reached behind the book. My fingers brushed against something cold and round, something small enough to be hidden in plain sight. I pulled it out and stared at it, my stomach lurching. It was a tiny wireless camera, the kind you see in spy movies. It was positioned perfectly to capture the entire living room. My blood ran cold as I turned it over, realizing that it had been active the whole time. I tried to figure out how long it had been there, how much it had captured. But the most unsettling part, it was still warm. Whoever had set this up had done it recently. Maybe last night, maybe even this morning, after I'd run out of the house. I pocketed the camera and checked the rest of the room, half expecting to find more hidden devices. I ran my fingers along every shelf, every piece of furniture, hoping to find something that would explain all of this. But instead, I found something far worse. My bedroom door was cracked open, just barely, but enough that I could see inside. I'd closed it before I left. I was sure of it. I'd locked it too, yet here it was, slightly ajar, as if someone had gone inside and forgotten to shut it completely. I pushed it open, inch by inch, every nerve in my body on high alert. The room looked empty, undisturbed. My bed was exactly as I'd left it, the sheets rumpled from where I tossed and turned last night. But then I noticed the mirror on my dresser. Something was written on it, faint but unmistakable, in a smudgy, greasy substance. It was a single word: tonight. The second I saw it, I stumbled back, the implication sinking in like a lead weight. Whoever was doing this was planning to come back tonight. They left me a warning, or maybe it was an invitation. I didn't know what to do, whether to run or to wait them out. I didn't want to leave the house, knowing they could come and go as they pleased. But staying felt just as dangerous, if not worse. I thought about calling the police again, but after the way they brushed me off last time, I doubted they'd take me seriously. So I decided to do the only thing I could think of. I set a trap. I knew they'd be back, so I started rigging up my own cameras, small, discreet ones I'd used on past investigations. I placed them around the house, hidden in the shadows, aimed at every possible entry point. I'd watch them from my laptop, keeping a close eye on the feeds to see if I could catch them in the act. By the time night fell, I'd turned my house into a makeshift surveillance hub. Every creak, every shadow had my heart racing. I was exhausted, running on adrenaline alone, but I stayed awake, eyes glued to the laptop screen, waiting for any sign of movement. Midnight came and went, and still, nothing. I checked my watch, fingers drumming nervously against the edge of my desk. Part of me wondered if they were even going to show up. Maybe they decided to mess with someone else, or maybe they were just toying with me, making me paranoid for the fun of it. And then, around 2 a.m., one of the camera feeds flickered. It was the feed from the front hallway. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, but then I saw it, a faint shadow moving just outside my front door. The camera caught the shape, barely there, almost blending into the darkness. It lingered there for a moment, shifting slightly, like they were testing the handle. I held my breath as I watched them, slowly, silently, open the door. They slipped inside, their movements almost unnaturally smooth. The person was wearing a long, dark coat with a hood that obscured their face. They moved with purpose, like they knew exactly where they were going. The figure stopped in the hallway, right in front of the living room camera. They tilted their head, almost like they were looking directly at the lens, even though I knew they couldn't see it. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I watched them reach into their coat and pull out something small and metallic. It was another camera. They placed it on the floor, aimed at my bedroom door, just like the one I'd found earlier. I watched, unable to look away, as they set up a new stream, right there in front of me, completely unaware that I was watching them back. And then, they pulled out a phone, typed something into it, and walked over to my laptop. They moved so quietly, it was like they were gliding across the floor. I froze as they hovered over my desk, their fingers brushing against the keyboard. For a second, I thought they were going to find my setup, maybe even catch me spying on them. but they just looked down, staring at my laptop screen as if they knew I was watching. And then, as if to confirm my worst fear, they leaned down, close enough for the cameras to catch a glimpse of their face. It was me. I stared at the screen, heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The person, the intruder, the one who had been watching me, was me, or at least someone who looked exactly like me. I don't mean a passing resemblance or the same height and build. I mean exactly like me. Same hair, same tired eyes, same little scar on my left cheek that I got from a bad fall as a kid. It was like watching myself on the screen, a twisted mirror reflection in real time. But the eyes, there was something off about the eyes. They were empty, almost too calm, as if they didn't belong to a human at all. They were my eyes, but they had none of the life or worry or fear I felt in that moment. My doppelganger leaned closer to the camera, staring straight into it, almost as if they could see me on the other side. They tilted their head, examining my laptop like they were looking at some strange, fascinating creature. I watched, frozen, as they slowly moved their hand across the keyboard. They were typing something, their fingers moving with a sort of precision that seemed alien. My laptop screen flickered, and then words began to appear in the open chat window, one slow letter at a time, as if typed by some unseen force. "Why are you watching yourself?" My stomach dropped. I didn't respond, too stunned to even move. My double tilted their head, as if amused by my silence. They typed again. "Didn't you hear me? You're supposed to be asleep." Every nerve in my body screamed at me to shut the laptop, to throw it across the room, to do anything to sever the connection, but I couldn't. My hands felt glued to the keyboard, like my body was working against me. Then, as I sat there, paralyzed, the figure on the screen leaned in even closer, so close that the grainy camera feed distorted. Their face filled the screen, taking up every inch of it, and for the first time, I noticed something even more unsettling than the empty eyes or the calm expression. Their face was just wrong, subtle, barely noticeable, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The corners of the mouth were stretched a bit too wide, the skin too smooth, like it was stretched over something beneath, something not quite human. And the eyes, though they looked like mine, had a strange glimmer, a reflective sheen like the eyes of an animal caught in headlights. It smiled, a slow, chilling smile that spread wider and wider until it was almost unnatural. And then, still grinning, my doppelganger typed a new message. "Let me in." I snapped out of my frozen state, slamming the laptop shut so hard I almost cracked the screen. My hands were trembling, my entire body drenched in cold sweat. I stumbled back, feeling dizzy, like the walls were closing in on me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't make myself move. Every instinct told me that if I stayed here, I wouldn't make it through the night. I heard footsteps, light, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. They were coming from the hallway, slow and deliberate. Someone was inside, heading toward the living room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How was this possible? How could someone look exactly like me, act like me, be me, and yet not be me at all? I forced myself to breathe, focusing on staying as silent as possible. The footsteps were closer now, just outside the room. I knew I didn't have much time. I glanced around for something, anything I could use as a weapon, but everything I grabbed seemed useless against whatever this thing was. And then, The footsteps stopped. I strained to hear any sound, but there was nothing, only an oppressive silence. I slowly crept toward the door, heart hammering in my chest. Just as I reached the frame, a low, distorted voice whispered from the hallway, a voice that sounded like mine, but warped, wrong. "Are you hiding from me?" My blood turned to ice. The voice was close, too close. I pressed myself against the wall, every muscle tensed, waiting for the intruder to come closer. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them on the other side of the wall, as if their presence alone was heavy enough to press into the air, suffocating, thick with malice. Then, in a horrifying instant, they started whispering. Not words, not even coherent sounds, but a low, guttural hum, like a twisted lullaby. I could feel the sound vibrating through the walls, through the floor, filling the entire room. It was maddening, like the noise was wrapping around my brain, squeezing tighter and tighter. And then, without warning, the humming stopped. A sharp, unnatural silence fell, thick and impenetrable. I held my breath, waiting for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. My pulse pounded in my ears as I took a cautious step forward, peeking around the corner. My doppelganger was standing there, in the center of the hallway, motionless, staring straight at me. Their face was blank, expressionless, but their eyes were wild, hungry, filled with a strange, unhinged excitement. They tilted their head, as if trying to understand me, to make sense of why I was afraid. I stepped back, heart racing, but they matched my movement, mirroring it perfectly, a twisted shadow of myself. I took another step, and they did the same, closing the distance between us. Every step I took, they matched, each movement a distorted reflection of my own, like some macabre dance. And then they stopped, a cruel smile spreading across their face. "Come on," they whispered, their voice low and mocking. "Aren't you curious about who you really are?" Something inside me snapped, a primal fear I couldn't control. I turned and ran, bolting toward the door as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps echoing mine, keeping perfect pace as if they were right on my heels. I reached the front door, fumbling with the lock, my hand shaking so badly I could barely turn it. But just as I managed to throw the door open, I felt something brush against my shoulder. A cold, lifeless touch, barely a graze, but enough to make my skin crawl. I stumbled out onto the porch, gasping for air, and slammed the door behind me. I kept running down the driveway and into the street, only stopping when I was a good 100 feet away. I turned back, heart pounding, expecting to see that twisted version of myself standing on the porch, staring after me. But there was no one there. The house was dark, silent, as if nothing had happened. I could see the faint glow of my laptop through the living room window, the screen still shut, a silent witness to everything that had just unfolded. I wanted to go back, to destroy the camera, the laptop, every single piece of technology that might let that thing reach me again. But something held me back, an instinctual fear that if I stepped foot inside that house, I might not come out again. I stayed there for hours, watching my own house, waiting for any sign of movement, any hint of that doppelganger creeping back out. The streets were empty, silent, and eventually, as dawn broke, exhaustion finally overwhelmed me, and I stumbled to my car, my mind numb with fear. I didn't go back inside that day. Instead, I drove to a motel on the far side of town, booking a room under a fake name, hoping that whatever was haunting me wouldn't be able to follow. I locked myself in, keeping every light on, every door bolted, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I sat there, wrapped in the motel's scratchy blankets, I checked my phone. There was a single unread notification, a message from an unknown number. It was a link, the same link to that dark web stream, and below it, a short, chilling message. Come home. You left something behind. I threw my phone across the room, the screen shattering against the wall. But it didn't matter. I knew that even if I destroyed every device I owned, every piece of technology, they would still find me. I stayed in that motel room for 2 days, barely sleeping, barely eating, constantly jumping at every sound. I kept the curtains drawn, the lights on, and the door bolted. My mind was running in circles, trying to make sense of everything, trying to convince myself that none of it was real. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that distorted smile, those empty eyes, my own face twisted into something that shouldn't exist. On the second night, I finally managed to drift off for a few hours, exhaustion overwhelming the fear. But I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. For a second, I thought I'd thrown it against the wall, shattered it completely. But there it was, on the nightstand, screen flickering, with a new notification, a message from my own number. The text was short, but it might as well have been a death sentence. Open the link. I wanted to ignore it, to throw the phone away again, and pretend none of this was happening. But some twisted part of me, some corner of my mind that couldn't let it go, needed to know. I knew that I was falling right into their trap, but I was too far gone to stop myself. I tapped the link. The stream opened, instantly familiar. The same grainy black and white footage, the same eerie quiet. But this time, the camera wasn't outside my house. It was inside, in my bedroom, staring right at the bed. And lying in the bed was me. I could see myself, sleeping fitfully, tossing and turning, a mirror image of what I'd done 2 nights before. But I wasn't at home. I was here, in this motel room. The impossibility of it twisted my mind, fraying the edges of my sanity as I watched myself on the screen. I watched as the figure in the bed, the version of me that shouldn't be there, sat up, moving with slow, deliberate movements, like they were aware of the camera, aware that I was watching. They looked straight into the lens, eyes wide, unblinking, filled with that same unnatural calm. And then they smiled. It was the same smile I'd seen before, that impossible, stretched grin that didn't belong on a human face. They mouthed something, the movements of their lips slow and exaggerated, as if they wanted to make sure I understood. Come home. I felt sick, my stomach twisting into knots. I slammed the laptop shut, my mind racing with panic. But it was too late. The damage was done. The image of that thing, my own face, my own body, twisted into something inhuman, was burned into my mind. The phone buzzed again. Another message from my own number. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I opened it, my hands shaking. We're waiting. I bolted out of the motel, my heart pounding as I drove through the empty streets, the dark houses looming like silent witnesses. I didn't know what I was doing or why I was doing it, but some force was pulling me back, some primal instinct that overpowered every shred of logic and self-preservation. The house was exactly as I'd left it, dark and silent, an empty shell waiting to swallow me whole. I parked across the street, sitting in my car, staring at the front door, half expecting it to open on its own. But nothing happened. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and stepped out of the car. The air was cold, biting, filled with the kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy and oppressive. I crossed the street, every step feeling like I was walking into my own grave. The front door was unlocked. I knew I'd locked it before I left, but somehow I wasn't surprised. I pushed it open, the creak echoing through the empty house, and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, an acrid metallic odor that made my nose wrinkle. It was the same smell I'd noticed before, lingering in the air, stronger now, almost overpowering. I moved through the darkened rooms, my footsteps muffled, the silence pressing in on me, and then I heard it, a faint humming, the same twisted lullaby I'd heard before. It was coming from the hallway, drifting toward me, chilling in its softness. I followed the sound, my mind numb with terror, my body moving on its own, drawn to the source. I stopped outside my bedroom door, the hum now so close, it felt like it was vibrating through the walls, through my bones. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the blinds drawn, casting strange shadows across the walls. And there, lying in my bed, was me. Or rather, it. The figure turned to face me, their eyes gleaming in the dim light, filled with that same unnatural calm. They looked at me with a strange kind of pity, as if they'd been waiting for this moment, as if I was finally coming home. "Why are you afraid?" they asked, their voice low, an echo of my own. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? To see the truth?" I backed away, heart pounding, but they sat up, swinging their legs over the edge of the bed, moving with that same eerie, unnatural grace. I couldn't look away, trapped by my own gaze, by the twisted reflection that stared back at me. "This isn't real," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You're not real." They tilted their head, a slow, mocking gesture. "Oh, but I am. I'm as real as you are. More even." They smiled, that same sickening grin. "You've been watching me all along, haven't you? Don't you remember?" I shook my head, refusing to believe it, but the memories started to bubble up, fragmented and disjointed. Strange, unexplainable moments from my investigations, things I'd brushed off as coincidence, flickers of movement, voices that sounded too familiar, shadows that followed me home. What are you?" I managed, my voice barely a whisper. They leaned forward, their eyes glinting with a dark amusement. "I'm you," they said simply, "the part of you that's been waiting, watching, the part that knows everything you've done, everything you've tried to forget." They stood up, taking a step toward me, and I took a step back, my entire body trembling. I didn't understand what they were saying, but some dark, horrible part of me knew they were telling the truth. "You wanted to see the other side, didn't you?" they murmured, their voice soft, almost gentle. "That's why you do what you do. Ghosts, spirits, the paranormal. It's all been leading you here, to me, to the truth." I backed into the wall, my legs weak, my mind fraying at the edges. They took another step, closing the distance between us, their face inches from mine. I could feel their breath, cold and lifeless, as if they were draining the warmth from the air. "You belong here," they whispered, their voice weaving through my mind, wrapping around my thoughts. "This is where you've always belonged." And then, in one horrifying instant, they reached out, their hand closing around mine, cold and unyielding. I tried to pull away, but their grip was like iron, pulling me closer, pulling me into their eyes, into that empty, endless void that lay beyond. I felt myself slipping, my vision blurring, my body going numb. The world around me started to fade, dissolving into darkness. until there was nothing left but their face, their eyes, and that terrible, mocking smile. The last thing I heard was their voice, echoing through the darkness, a final whisper that cut through the silence. "You're home." And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was gone. When I woke up, I was lying on my bed, alone, the room empty and silent. The house was just as I'd left it, nothing out of place, no sign of the doppelganger, no evidence of the twisted nightmare I just endured. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw it, a faint, knowing smile, tugging at the corners of my mouth, a smile that wasn't mine. I'm a private tutor for a wealthy family. The dark web says the family's mansion is haunted. I keep seeing a girl who isn't my student. Alright, so this might sound like something straight out of a bad horror movie, but I swear, this has been my life for the past couple of weeks, and I don't know who else to tell. I'm still trying to figure out if I'm just overthinking things or if I'm actually losing my mind. But either way, maybe putting it out there will help me get some perspective. So here goes. A month ago, I got hired as a private tutor for a ridiculously wealthy family. We're talking one of those families that owns a ton of property, operates a few businesses you've definitely heard of, and has a last name that carries weight, if you know what I mean. They reached out through this exclusive tutoring agency, and the offer was too good to pass up. Double what I'd normally make, housing provided, plus a signing bonus that made my student loans feel a whole lot lighter. I'm supposed to tutor their son, Julian. He's a quiet kid, maybe 10 or 11, sharp as a tack, but shy, like he's been sheltered way too much. The family's house, well, calling it a house feels like an insult. It's this massive, old-school mansion tucked away in the woods with sprawling gardens and a gate that probably costs more than my entire car. It's got that sort of dark wood paneling, old paintings, and creaky floors vibe, and at night it just feels wrong. But whatever, right? It's a job. People live in these creepy old mansions all the time. But here's where things get weird. On my first night there, I was settling into the guest wing. Yep, they have an entire wing just for guests, when I got this weird idea to look up the house. You know, like a random Google search, just to see if it's famous or has any history. I didn't find much at first, just some public records about the family owning it for generations, some articles about it being architecturally significant, that kind of thing. Boring stuff. But then I started going deeper. I found this forum thread, buried in a corner of the internet, where people talked about local hauntings and urban legends. And there it was, the mansion, right in the middle of all these ghost stories. The thread claimed it was haunted by a girl, lost in the walls, who only appears to strangers. People said they could hear her laughing or crying, see her shadow moving behind the windows, and sometimes even catch a glimpse of her reflection where she wasn't supposed to be. Most people on the thread thought it was just an urban legend, but there was one guy who posted about how he'd worked as a handyman there a few years back. He said he'd quit because he kept seeing the girl in the hallways. He claimed she was dressed in a white nightgown, her hair messy, and her eyes wide, as if she had been caught by surprise every time someone saw her. People were all over the post, saying he was faking it, that he was lying, but he was insistent, swore it had happened. His account honestly sounded like he was terrified even years later. I brushed it off as just creepy internet stuff and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling as I lay there, hearing the wind whistle through those massive windows, that something was off about this place. The silence was too deep, you know, like everything around me was watching, listening. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever been in an old, empty building alone, you know what I mean. The next morning, I met Julian in the study room they set up for our sessions. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little creeped out, but he was quiet and polite, and honestly, a pretty good student. We went over some math and history, and he was polite, even eager to learn. But here's the thing. About halfway through the lesson, I noticed his eyes kept darting over my shoulder toward the hallway behind me. I asked him if everything was all right, and he just nodded, not really answering. So I turned around, half expecting one of his parents or a maid or someone to be standing there. But there was no one, just the empty hallway stretching out into shadows. After a couple of hours, I wrapped up the lesson, and Julian asked if he could show me something. He led me through the house, up 2 flights of stairs, down a long hallway with these massive, heavy curtains that made everything feel dim and dusty. At the end of the hallway, he stopped in front of this door. It was just an ordinary door, except that it had one of those old-fashioned locks, the kind with a keyhole you could peek through. He looked at me with this strange, serious expression and said, "Don't go in here. Ever." Then he walked away without another word, like it was no big deal. Just left me standing there, staring at this random door at the end of a hallway I could barely find my way back from. Now, I'm not stupid. I know when a kid's messing with me, but the way he said it, like he'd practiced those words, like it was something he was told to say, it freaked me out. It wasn't just a keep out warning. It felt like he genuinely believed something bad would happen if I opened that door. For the rest of the day, I tried to focus on my lesson plans, but I kept thinking about that door. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see it at the end of the hallway, like it was waiting for me. And honestly, I felt watched, like there was something in the house, something I couldn't see, but that definitely saw me. That night, I barely slept. Every little creak in the house made me jump, and it felt like there were footsteps in the hallway, outside my room, soft and slow, stopping just outside my door and then moving away. I kept telling myself it was just old pipes, that these houses make noises, but it didn't help. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I kept glancing toward my door, half expecting to see a shadow or hear something scratching at the wood. When morning finally came, I thought maybe I was overreacting, letting the house and the internet stories get to me. But then something happened that I can't explain. As I was heading to breakfast, I turned a corner and saw her. A girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, in a long white nightgown, standing at the end of the hallway, watching me. She was there for just a second, staring at me with wide, empty eyes, and then she was gone. I could feel my stomach drop, and my skin turn cold. There was no way she could have slipped out of view that quickly. It was like she just vanished. I wanted to tell myself it was my imagination, that maybe it was just the light or my mind playing tricks on me. But as I made my way back to the study for Julian's lesson, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen her, that she was real. And somehow, I knew she wasn't Julian's sister. I'll be honest, after seeing that girl, I started questioning if this was all just in my head. Maybe it was too many late nights, too much reading up on ghost stories about the house. So, I told myself that from now on, I was going to focus on work and ignore the creepy stuff. No more searching up the mansion, no more wandering around at night, and definitely no more lurking on those horror forums. But of course, things weren't that simple. Over the next few days, I kept noticing little things. It wasn't just shadows moving out of the corner of my eye or doors creaking when there was no draft. It was more unsettling than that. It felt like the house had a heartbeat, a rhythm. The air seemed to change depending on where I stood. Near Julian's study, everything felt tense, heavy, as if something was waiting, crouched, holding its breath. In the garden, things felt different, almost indifferent, like I was safe, but also completely alone, like the house didn't care about me there. Then came the whispers. It started one evening after Julian's lesson. I was heading back to my room when I heard this faint sound. It was soft, almost inaudible at first, like a breeze brushing against the walls. But as I got closer to my room, it got louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out words, but it sounded like voices, multiple voices, whispering all at once, overlapping in this strange, haunting rhythm. I froze, straining to listen, and that's when I realized they were coming from down the hall, from behind the locked door Julian had warned me about. Now, look, I know curiosity killed the cat and all that, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted to go and look. Part of me was itching to find out what was behind that door. But as I took a step closer, the whispers stopped, like they'd heard me coming. The silence that followed was worse than the voices. It felt thick, like I was being dared to come closer, to put my ear to the door and listen. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. The way Julian had warned me, the way he'd looked at me so seriously, it stuck with me. I backed away and hurried back to my room, shutting the door behind me and locking it. But here's the thing. When I closed my door, I swear I heard something move in the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was pacing right outside, just on the other side of my door. I pressed my ear to the wood, holding my breath, listening, and the footsteps stopped. I waited, but there was nothing after that. Just the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. That night, I barely slept again. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that little girl at the end of the hall, staring at me. And every time I managed to drift off, I'd jerk awake, convinced I'd heard her voice. It was like she was hovering just at the edge of my consciousness, watching me, waiting for me to notice her. The next morning, I asked Julian about his family, hoping he'd casually mention a sister or a cousin or something that would make sense of what I'd seen. But he looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "No," he said quietly. "It's just me and my parents." "Are you sure?" I pressed, trying to keep it casual. "No cousins visiting? Or maybe a friend of the family?" He just shook his head, looking almost sad, like he understood what I was really asking, but couldn't say more. His eyes kept drifting to that hallway, toward that locked door, and his face went pale. "Did you hear her?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear who?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, even though I could feel my heart beating in my throat. He didn't answer. He just looked down at his book, refusing to meet my eyes. That was the first time I really started to feel afraid for him. Julian seemed like a smart kid, the kind who wouldn't be easily fooled or scared, but the way he avoided talking about the girl, the way he kept glancing at the hallway, like he was expecting someone to appear, it wasn't the behavior of a kid playing a prank. It was the behavior of someone who knew something I didn't, something real. Later that day, I found myself alone in the library. The mansion's library was this vast two-story room with books from floor to ceiling, the kind of place where you'd expect to see one of those sliding ladders and dust thick enough to write your name in. As I wandered the aisles, half-heartedly browsing, I noticed an entire section on local history. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started flipping through a few of the books, hoping to find some mention of the house or its previous owners. Most of it was dry, boring stuff. Records of land transfers, old maps, that kind of thing. But then, tucked between two thicker books, I found this tiny, thin volume. No title on the spine, just a faded cover that looked as old as the house itself. Inside, there were these brief, clipped notes, like journal entries, but they weren't dated or signed. It was all vague references, but one section caught my attention. There was an entry about the girl. It talked about how she appears to strangers, just like that forum post I'd read, and that she seemed drawn to anyone unfamiliar with the house. But here's the kicker. It said she was lost in the walls. Like, actually lost. As if the walls themselves had swallowed her up. There were scribbled notes about hearing her crying at night, about seeing her reflection in places where she wasn't supposed to be. And then, at the bottom of the page, there was a single line that made my blood run cold. She waits in the locked rooms for someone to find her. I shut the book and shoved it back onto the shelf, feeling like I'd just read something I wasn't supposed to see. But I couldn't shake that line. It felt like a warning, like she was waiting for me, specifically, to open that door. Over the next few days, things got worse. The whispers started up again, always coming from that same locked room. I heard them at random times, sometimes in the middle of the night, other times in broad daylight. And they weren't just whispers anymore. They were soft, pitiful cries, the kind you might hear from a child lost and afraid. And then, 3 days later, I saw her again. I was walking back to my room after dinner when I caught a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, and there she was, standing in the middle of the hallway, looking right at me. She was closer this time, close enough that I could see her pale, tear-streaked face and the tangled mess of her hair. Her eyes were wide, almost desperate, and she held out one hand toward me, like she wanted me to come closer. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with her hand outstretched, waiting. And then, as quickly as she'd appeared, she was gone. Just like that. 1 second she was there, the next she was gone, leaving only the empty hallway and the silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I stumbled back to my room, locked the door, and tried to calm myself down. But as I lay in bed, every sound in the house felt magnified, every creak and groan echoing in my ears. I kept seeing her face every time I closed my eyes, that desperate, haunted look in her eyes. And all I could think was that maybe, just maybe, Julian had been right. Maybe I should never, ever open that door. But something in me was beginning to wonder. What if she was trapped? What if she was waiting for me to help her? And what would happen if I ignored her for too long? The night after seeing her for the second time, I barely slept. Every time I thought I'd managed to drift off, I'd hear something. A soft knock against the wall, the faintest sound of someone walking just outside my door, or worse, that same crying from the hallway. I tried to rationalize it as the creaking of an old house settling, the wind brushing against the windows, but in my gut, I knew that wasn't it. I had one mission the next morning, talk to someone, anyone, in the house about what was going on. The only problem, I almost never saw Julian's parents. They were out at odd hours, slipping in and out of the house as though they wanted to avoid being seen. I'd sometimes hear them down a hallway or catch a glimpse of his mother's heels clicking on the marble, but they never stopped to chat. The only people I ever had contact with were Julian and occasionally the housekeeper, a middle-aged woman named Evelyn, who only came in once every few days to tidy up and prepare meals. That morning, I caught Evelyn in the kitchen as she was cleaning up breakfast. I knew she'd been working for the family for a while, and I figured if anyone would know about the strange things going on, it would be her. "Evelyn," I started, trying to sound casual, "do you know anything about a girl in the house? Like maybe a family friend or a distant relative?" Evelyn froze, her hand hovering over the sink. She didn't look at me, but I could see her fingers tremble as she clenched the dish rag. There was a long pause before she finally spoke. "There are no other children here, Mr. Gray," she said, her voice low and strained. "Just Julian." Her tone made it clear she didn't want to discuss it further, but something in the way she avoided my eyes, the way her shoulders tensed, told me she knew more than she was letting on. So I pushed, despite the warning in her voice. "I've seen her, Evelyn," I whispered, leaning closer. "She's wearing a white nightgown, and she looks lost. I think she might be trying to—" She cut me off, slamming a pot into the sink louder than necessary. "Mr. Gray, some things are better left alone," she hissed, her eyes darting around the room, as if even talking about the girl could summon her. "If you value your safety, and Julian's, you'll leave it alone. Don't go looking for things that aren't meant to be found." Then she turned back to her work, her body language making it very clear that the conversation was over. I left the kitchen feeling more confused than ever. If Evelyn was so terrified just talking about the girl, then maybe there was something genuinely dangerous in that house. And if that was the case, why was I still there? Why was Julian still there? I tried to shake it off and focus on our lesson for the day, but Julian seemed even more withdrawn than usual. He kept glancing toward the hallway, his fingers tapping nervously against the desk. I decided to risk asking him again. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice soft, "do you know anything about the girl? I keep seeing her, and I can't help feeling like like she's trapped." He stared down at his hands, biting his lip. For a moment, I thought he was going to ignore me again, but then he whispered, "She's not trapped. She's just waiting." My skin prickled at the way he said it, so calm, so certain. I wanted to press him for more, to make him explain, but his gaze slid to the doorway behind me, and his face went pale. "Mr. Gray, please don't talk about her," he whispered, his voice trembling. "When people talk about her, she listens." I followed his gaze to the doorway, half expecting to see her standing there, her wide, unblinking eyes staring at us. But there was nothing, just the empty hall stretching out in shadow. I didn't bring it up again, and we finished our lesson in silence. But the more I thought about it, the more a part of me felt like Julian was right. The girl wasn't just a spirit or some figment of my imagination. She felt aware, like she was watching, waiting, listening. That evening, as I was heading back to my room, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, but as I got closer to my room, it grew louder. A song, being hummed softly, like a lullaby. The sound drifted through the air, light and haunting, and for a second, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the girl. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. The humming seemed to be coming from down the hall, near the door Julian had warned me about. I don't know what possessed me to follow it, but I found myself walking toward that door, drawn by the haunting melody. It was like I was in a trance, my feet moving without my permission. When I reached the door, the humming stopped. I held my breath, pressing my ear against the wood, waiting, listening. And then, faintly, I heard a whisper. "Help me." The words were so soft, so broken, that I almost thought I'd imagined them. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A small, desperate voice pleading from the other side of the door. "Help me!" I should have walked away. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to get out of that house and never look back. But I couldn't. I reached out, my hand shaking, and tried the doorknob. It was locked, just like Julian had said. But as I pulled my hand back, I felt something cold slip into my palm. I looked down, and there it was, a small, rusted key. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere, nestled in my hand like it had been waiting for me. I stood there staring at the key, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I knew that opening that door would be a mistake. Every fiber of my being was telling me to walk away, to throw the key down and pretend I'd never found it. But I was already in too deep. I had to know what was behind that door. Slowly, I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The click echoed through the hallway, loud and final. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me first. Stale, musty, like something that had been left untouched for decades. The room was dark, only the faint glow from the hallway spilling in, but I could make out the shapes of furniture shrouded in dust-covered sheets. And then I saw her. She was sitting in the middle of the room, her back to me, her figure slumped and motionless. She looked smaller, frailer than I remembered, like a broken doll abandoned on the floor. Her nightgown was tattered, and her hair hung in messy, tangled strands. I took a step forward, my hands shaking, and as if sensing me, she slowly turned her head. Her face was pale, hollow, her eyes wide and empty, like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her mouth opened, and a soft, rasping voice came out. Just one word. "Help." I couldn't move. I was frozen, locked in place by the raw, desperate look in her eyes. She looked like she was on the verge of tears, like she was begging me to pull her out of some invisible prison. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say anything, she reached out, her hand hovering in the air between us. "Please, don't leave me," she whispered, her voice cracking. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to help her, to pull her out of that room and save her from whatever nightmare she was trapped in. But then, something changed. Her eyes darkened, her face twisted into something I can only describe as pure malice, and her hand shot forward, grabbing my wrist in an iron grip. Her skin was ice cold, like she'd been lying in a grave. I tried to pull away, but her grip was unbreakable, her fingers digging into my flesh with unnatural strength. Her mouth twisted into a horrible smile, and in a voice that was no longer pleading, but full of hatred, she hissed, "You shouldn't have come here." Panic surged through me as I struggled to break free, but she held tight, her nails biting into my skin, drawing blood. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and fell to the floor, finally breaking her grip. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. The second I locked the door, The whispers started again, louder this time, like a chorus of voices echoing through the walls. I backed away, clutching my wrist, where her nails had broken the skin, and sprinted back to my room. I locked the door and collapsed on the floor, my heart racing, my mind reeling. I sat there, gasping for breath, feeling the sting of her nails still fresh on my wrist, the faint smell of must lingering in my nostrils. I knew I'd made a mistake. I knew I'd opened something that should have stayed closed. And somehow, I knew this wasn't over. The next morning, everything felt different. The house seemed heavier, like the walls themselves were weighed down, pressing in on me from all sides. Even the air had this suffocating thickness, and the silence felt almost hostile. I kept my distance from Julian, still shaken by what had happened the night before. He noticed, of course. His eyes lingered on my wrist, where faint, thin scratches were still visible, trailing like a reminder of her grip. He didn't ask about it, though. He just watched me with this solemn expression, as if he knew exactly what I'd seen and done. Throughout the day, the whispers came and went. Sometimes they'd fade into nothing, so soft I could almost convince myself they were gone. But then, out of nowhere, they'd return, louder, sharper, as if they were growing bolder. I'd be sitting alone in the study, or brushing past a hallway, and I'd hear them, a faint hum of voices just out of reach, like an endless chant. And there was one phrase I kept picking out, repeated over and over, like a warning, "Come closer." I did my best to ignore it. I forced myself to focus on Julian's lessons, to keep my head down and pretend everything was normal. But it wasn't just the whispers anymore. Objects started moving. Little things. Books that shifted out of place. Doors that would be open when I was certain I'd closed them. Lights flickering just as I walked into a room. And every time it happened, I'd get this feeling like someone was right behind me, watching, waiting for me to slip up. Then there were the mirrors. On the third night, after unlocking the door, I caught my reflection moving. I was brushing my teeth, staring absently into the bathroom mirror, trying to block out the whispering that seemed to pulse from the walls. I spit out the toothpaste, rinsed, and glanced up, and that's when I saw it. My reflection hadn't moved. It was just standing there, staring back at me, eyes a little too wide, mouth slightly open, as if it had frozen in that exact moment. I blinked, but it stayed still, locked in place, even though I could feel my own muscles tensing, my own breath catching in my throat. And then slowly, the reflection's eyes moved. They shifted upward, meeting mine with an expression that wasn't mine, that couldn't be mine. A kind of cruel, knowing look, one that sent a chill down my spine. And then it smiled. Not a friendly smile, not even a mocking one. It was the same twisted smile the girl had given me in that room, a smile that looked hungry, almost predatory. I stumbled back, breaking eye contact, and in that split second, the reflection snapped back to normal, mirroring my own horrified expression. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination born of sleepless nights. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Every mirror, every shiny surface, felt like it was hiding something just beneath, a shadow waiting to slip out the moment I looked away. I started avoiding them, walking quickly past anything that could cast my reflection. It felt ridiculous, childish, but every time I saw myself, I felt her watching from behind my eyes, as if she'd found a way to reach me, even outside that locked room. I didn't know what else to do, so I decided to go to Evelyn again. She'd been distant since our last conversation, always busy with some chore or rushing off as soon as I came near. But I found her in the laundry room, sorting through a pile of freshly washed sheets. When I stepped inside, she didn't look up, just kept folding, her hands moving quickly, almost frantically. "Evelyn," I said, my voice sounding strange, hollow in the silence of the laundry room. "I need to know what's going on. The girl, the whispers, the mirrors. I can't take it anymore. Please, tell me what this place is hiding." She paused, her hands gripping a sheet so tightly her knuckles went white. For a long time, she didn't speak. When she finally looked up, there was fear in her eyes, deep and raw, like she'd been waiting for this conversation for years. "I warned you, Mr. Gray," she said, her voice trembling. "I warned you to leave it alone." "But I didn't," I replied, my frustration bubbling over. "I saw her. I opened the door. I felt her touch me. She's not just a ghost, is she? She's something else. Something wrong." Evelyn swallowed, glancing around the room as if expecting the walls themselves to start listening. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "This house, it's a prison. For her, and for anyone else unlucky enough to see her." "What do you mean?" I demanded, my mind racing. "Who is she?" She looked down, folding and refolding the same sheet, as if to avoid meeting my eyes. "Years ago, before I started working here, there was a girl who lived in this house, a child of the family. She disappeared one night. No one ever found her. The family searched for months, but it was like she'd vanished into thin air. After that, strange things started happening. The whispers, the shadows in the mirrors. They say her spirit couldn't leave, that it was trapped here. But it's not just her spirit, Mr. Gray. It's something worse." Evelyn's voice dropped lower, her hand still gripping the sheet. "She's hungry, Mr. Gray. She's not just lost. She needs someone to replace her, someone to take her place in the wars. That's why she appears to strangers, why she's drawn to people like you. She's trying to escape." A cold shiver ran through me as I realized what she was saying. The girl wasn't just some lost soul haunting the house. She was trapped here, and she was using me, luring me, pulling me closer and closer so that she could finally break free. "Is there a way to stop her?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Evelyn shook her head slowly, her eyes full of regret. "I don't know. I only know that once she's chosen you, once you've seen her, heard her voice, it's already too late. She'll keep pulling you in, piece by piece, until you're the one behind that door, until you're the one she leaves behind." I backed away, horror flooding my mind. I didn't say another word to Evelyn. I just turned and walked out, my footsteps echoing through the hallways, feeling the weight of her warning settling like a stone in my chest. She was right. Whatever I'd set loose was getting closer, and I could feel it with every breath. That night, I barricaded myself in my room, piling furniture in front of the door and closing every curtain. I avoided every reflective surface, forcing myself to keep my gaze down. But the whispers were louder than ever, rising and falling like a sinister lullaby, and the shadows seemed to pulse, pressing in from the corners of the room. As the hours dragged on, I felt myself slipping, my mind spiraling in and out of sleep. And then, at some point, in the early hours of the morning, I heard it. A knock on the other side of the wall, slow, steady, like someone tapping to get my attention. It came again and again, this soft, rhythmic knock, coming from somewhere behind the walls of my room. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened as the knocks grew louder, more insistent. They moved, traveling from one side of the room to the other, like someone was moving through the walls, trying to find a way in. And then, just as suddenly, they stopped. I held my breath, staring at the wall, waiting, listening. And then, there was a soft, barely audible whisper right next to my ear. "Let me in." I stumbled out of bed, grabbing anything I could to defend myself. But there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the silence pressing down like a weight. But when I turned toward the mirror, I saw her. She was standing just behind me, her pale face barely visible in the shadows, her eyes locked on mine with that same hungry, desperate look. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but the intent was clear. She was waiting, watching, waiting, and wanting me to come closer, to step forward just a few inches and let her take my place. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the floor, refusing to look at her reflection. I knew if I met her gaze, if I gave in to that strange pull, I'd be hers. The night dragged on, every second stretching into eternity. But finally, the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The whispers faded, and I could feel the weight of her presence lifting, like she was retreating back into the walls, biding her time. But I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel her, lurking just out of sight, waiting for her next chance. And as I stumbled out of the room, exhausted and terrified, I knew that I couldn't stay in this house any longer. I had to leave before she claimed me, before I became the next shadow in the mirror, the next lost voice whispering from behind locked doors. But the worst part, as I stumbled down the hallway, feeling the weight of her gaze following me, I heard her voice, soft and mocking, drifting from somewhere deep within the walls. "I'll be waiting, Mr. Gray." And I knew, deep down, that no matter where I went, she would follow. I spent the next day in a haze, barely able to think, let alone teach. Julian noticed, of course. He was sharper than most kids his age, always observing, always noticing the things other people missed. By now, I was past trying to hide my fear. It was clear as day, hanging over me like a shadow. Julian didn't say a word during our lesson, just watched me with those big, solemn eyes, as if he knew exactly what I was going through. When our lesson ended, he finally spoke. "You're leaving, aren't you?" The question startled me, and I just looked at him, caught off guard by how direct he was. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to lie, to reassure him, but there was no point. I couldn't stay in that house. I wasn't even sure I'd make it through one more night. "Yeah, Julian," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think I have to." He nodded, looking down at his hands, fidgeting nervously. After a long pause, he muttered, "She won't let you go." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to demand answers, but I was terrified of what he might say. The look in his eyes was one of genuine sadness, like he'd seen this all happen before, like he already knew what was coming. I didn't bother packing that night. I just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, listening to the house settle around me. Every creak, every groan of the floorboards felt like it was alive, shifting and breathing. I knew the girl was somewhere nearby, waiting, her presence pressing in from the walls. The whispers had started again, a low, constant hum that seemed to seep into my bones. I could almost make out words now, soft, twisted fragments of sentences, but I refused to listen. I was determined to leave at dawn, to get out of that house and never look back. But as the hours dragged on, that resolve began to waver. There was something insidious about the way the house closed in around me. Something that made every second feel like a test, like she was daring me to try and escape. Around midnight, the air in the room grew colder. I could see my own breath hanging in the air, and a sudden weight settled over me, making it hard to move, hard to even think. The whispers grew louder, rising to an almost unbearable pitch, and I felt something shift in the room, a presence pressing in from every side. I don't know why, but I looked toward the mirror. There she was. This time, she was standing right behind me, so close I could feel the chill radiating from her. Her face was drawn, her eyes wide and hollow, that same hungry look twisting her features. Her lips were moving, mouthing words I couldn't hear, but I knew she was speaking to me, calling me to her. I forced myself to look away, to tear my gaze from the mirror. I knew if I looked for too long, if I let her draw me in, I'd be hers. But the whispers were everywhere now, filling my head, pulling me closer to that dark, awful place where she waited. It was like she was trying to pull me into her world, to trap me in the same nightmare she was trapped in. And then, out of nowhere, there was a knock on my door. It was soft, almost hesitant, like whoever or whatever was on the other side was waiting for me to open it. My heart stopped, and I felt my blood turn to ice. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the door, listening as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. Then I heard her voice, whispering from the other side. "Let me in." I scrambled back, pressing myself against the wall, as far from the door as I could get. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, pounding, like something was throwing itself against the wood, desperate to get inside. "Let me in," she cried, her voice twisting into a wail that echoed through the room, rattling the walls. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was everywhere, filling the room, pressing in from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was thick, suffocating, like the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I sat there shaking, trying to steady my breathing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. And then I felt it, a soft, icy hand brushing against my shoulder. I jumped, spinning around, but there was no one there. Just the empty room, the shadows twisting and shifting around me. But I knew she was there, lurking just out of sight, watching me, waiting for me to slip, to give in. I don't remember falling asleep, but at some point, exhaustion must have finally claimed me, because the next thing I knew, I was lying on the bed, the early light of dawn spilling through the curtains. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief. The sunlight made the room feel warmer, safer, and for a brief second, I thought I'd survived the night, that I'd made it through without giving in to her. But then I looked at my wrist. Where she'd grabbed me, there was something carved into my skin, thin, pale lines that formed a word. I couldn't tell if it was real or some lingering hallucination from the night before. But the word was clear, sharp, like a fresh scar. Stay. I stumbled out of bed, my heart pounding, and ran to the mirror. The scratches were still there, faint but unmistakable. It was like a mark, a claim she had made on me, something that tied me to the house, to her. I knew then that leaving wasn't going to be as simple as I'd thought. She'd left her mark on me, claimed a part of me, and I could feel her presence lingering, watching, waiting, but I had to try. I grabbed my things, threw on my coat, and made my way down the winding hallways as quietly as I could. The house was eerily silent, almost like it knew I was leaving. I felt the weight of her gaze following me, pressing in from the walls, from the mirrors, from every dark corner I passed. When I reached the front door, I paused, my hand on the knob, feeling that last surge of fear. It was as if the house itself was begging me to stay, like it didn't want to let me go. But I forced myself to turn the knob, to pull the door open and step outside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air shifted, the weight lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. I didn't look back as I walked down the driveway, out of the gate, and into the morning light. I didn't hear from the family after that. I left the mansion, drove as far as I could, and checked myself into a hotel, where I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that it was all over, that she was gone, that whatever haunted that house hadn't followed me. But I knew deep down that it wasn't that simple. A week later, I was brushing my teeth in my hotel room when I glanced up at the mirror. For a second, I thought I saw something, a faint, pale outline of a figure just behind me. But when I looked again, it was gone, replaced by my own tired reflection. And then I heard it, faint and far away, just a whisper. "Let me in." Since then, she's been with me. In every mirror, every reflective surface, every shadow that lingers just a little too long, she's there, watching, waiting, never letting me forget. And now, every night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear her voice, whispering from somewhere in the darkness, her words seeping into my mind, twisting into my thoughts. I don't know how much longer I can resist. She's patient, relentless, waiting for the moment I let my guard down, the moment I finally give in. And when that moment comes, I know I'll be hers. She's still waiting,